All right. Welcome to Unit 6. This is talking about Gregor Mendel and heredity or Mendelian genetics. We're going to look and understand what that means. Before we really dive into our notes, I wanted to lay the groundwork for why it's important. When we look at genetic defects or genetics that can be passed down through generations, sometimes we think of things like hair color and eye color, but there's also a bigger picture, the things that make us very, very unique. And over the course of human history, we've learned a lot about genetics, not always through science, sometimes just through observation. We've looked at heritable or traits that can be passed on down through animals. Think about our modern dogs. There's things as big as a Great Dane and small as a Chihuahua, and they all were derived from the wolf. And how do we get these far different traits? Breeding. Different types of breeding. We would breed certain characteristics into a dog, or we wouldn't breed, this dog that had these certain traits, or we'd crossbreed them and see what happens. But that kind of thinking shows us so much about genetics today. Now, thankfully, we have science to help us understand these genetic characteristics and even these genetic defects. But over all of time, we haven't had those things. So what we wind up with is lots of myths and legends, myths and mutants, where we see heritable or passed down certain deformities or genetic defects in humans, where people would look at them as, instead of understanding from a scientific standpoint what is going on with that person, they would look at them as possibly a myth or a quote-unquote freak. And this has been happening for over 5,000 years. Even in Babylonia, an ancient civilization, we see records of certain birth defects or children born with physical characteristics outside of the norm. All right? We see it in other cultures, even some today, where certain social customs, excuse me, I had to sneeze, customs like choosing a spouse came down to, did that person have a certain physical characteristic, right? Oh, I'm not going to marry and procreate with someone that, that doesn't meet up to the standards that I want them to have physically. It plays a huge role in certain cultures even today. So, I mentioned a minute ago, like crossbreeding with animals like dogs. Here's a part goat and a part sheep, where two embryos were mixed. So people over time have been playing with these things, trying to figure it out. We still do this today, whether you realize it or not. Big segments of agriculture has come down. Why do we want a certain type of cattle that puts out a lot of meat? How do we get there? Because we make money off of it. But how did we get there? By a lot of crossbreeding, a lot of trying out different things in genetics. And it's led to our understanding of it, thankfully. And here's just some examples of two people with giantism and dwarfism. Now we have, scientific understanding of what's going on with these people. We can look in their chromosomes and also see why they have this certain genetic traits. But you could imagine if we didn't have that type of understanding, what would we think about these type of people? Would we, consider them flawed? Would we be scared of them or sad or worried if we're around them? Or would we potentially even worship them as like a demigod, like a pseudo-god, or like a supernatural being? And this isn't thousands and thousands of years ago. Instead, just in the last 150 years, we've had things like freak shows where people paid money to get to see individuals with certain unique genetic makeups. Sadly, they were exploited most of the time, made money off of, and they didn't become very famous on their own. Here's just some different pictures of a cat with a certain type of genetic defect, where he gave him little tiny legs, looks like a little T-Rex cat. I'm looking at some other cats. Here's some other genetic defects ranging from making them super huge to many different fingers or toes on these feet. And then we see some conjoined twins where there's two sets of faces or many, many different appendages. Here's a lizard that didn't fully separate in the womb. And this also happens to humans. Here's a great image from the last probably 150 years of a man that had, his twin, joined twin, still stuck to him. This is a picture, called him the Unicorn Man. Pretty interesting, just a normal dude, except he had a keratin. Keratin makes up fingernails and hair. A keratin horn growing out of his head. There's some documentaries. I say lots. There's a few documentaries out there about him if you look it up. Some other examples of conjoined twins, just they didn't fully separate that in the past and also more modern times. When we look at genetic defects, it's not always, crazy out there looking genetic defects. Instead, it could just be being a little hairy in certain circumstances. Different types of hypertrichosis here. This hairy ears is because of a genetic defect on one little gene. One gene on the chromosomes. It's actually found on the Y chromosome. So it only occurs in males because males have XY on their sex chromosomes. Females have XX. And if somebody has this, they're going to pass it on to every one of their sons. I think this is the dad, and these are both sons that have this hairy ear defect. Polydactyly is a genetic defect where someone has extra fingers or extra toes. And it comes in several different forms, like my dude here. Wendy the Whippet was a little semi-internet famous a few years ago. This dog did not, don't do bench presses to get this big. Instead, it's actually a mutation of its myostatin gene, which causes muscle buildup. And so, this dog got jacked on its own just because of the genetics it had. But it's not just dogs. Other mammals and fish, so lots of different types of animals can have it. So here's one with a mouse. This is the control. In other words, this don't have it. You can see how huge these muscles grow with that genetic defect. Another type, congenital generalized hypertrichosis terminalis, causes people to be hairy over most of their body. There's several different documentaries and little TV shows out there about the Wolf Boy was one a few years ago that I remember, where most of their body, about 90%, 96% or more, is coated in hair. It's all based on their genetic defects or their genes. There was some stuff a few years ago, a story about the tree people. This is people kind of like the Unicorn Man a few slides back, where had excessive keratin growth. Joseph Merrick was known affectionately, I suppose, as the Elephant Man. He actually was very college educated and turned into a pretty good life despite these abnormalities, neurofibromatosis type 1 and Proteus disease or syndrome. He had tumors on his body. You can kind of see him there. Here's a good look at the rest of his body with these tumors that hang off. You can imagine, this was his skull after he passed. So it wasn't just soft tissue. It was in here, even on the bone. You can imagine, and here's some modern looks at the same disorder that the Elephant Man had. You can imagine how this can impact your lifestyle. Beside the societal impact, dealing with other people and what they're going to say and do and think, just the day-to-day, where these tumors can press on your nerves and make just every day-to-day living uncomfortable. So here's some other perspectives on that. And then we also have things like cleft palates. You might have seen somebody, you might know somebody with a cleft palate. Now, not all cleft palates are caused by genetics. Somewhere a few percentage of all cleft palates are caused by genetics. So if you had a cleft palate as a mom or dad, you have a risk of passing that on down to your kids. And we're going to look at that. So when we look at genetics, we need to really start at Gregor Mendel. In the last couple of days, you should have done some assignments looking at the life and findings of Gregor Mendel. So I'm not going to repeat all that here because you've had those assignments. But he laid the groundwork for genetics, and we're going to see some of his experiments here in a minute a little closer. Going over your notes, traits, a term that we're going to use, are distinguishing characteristics that are inherited. So certain physical characteristics that can be passed on to offspring. Genetics is the study of biological inheritance patterns and variations. So there's certain patterns, and a lot of people love this about genetics, that we can make accurate predictions about what offspring are going to look like, or what are the chances that they're going to have certain physical characteristics. Gregor Mendel showed that these things passed down, are inherited as discrete units. meaning that a long time ago, people thought that if both parents were brown-haired and brown-eyed, they had to have children that were brown-haired and brown-eyed. Instead, traits stand on their own. You could have, brown hair and green eyes, no matter what your parents, looked like with that hair and eyes. You could have a child that had the brown eyes but had blonde hair. Okay, they're discrete units, meaning that they stand on their own. They're not blended or mixed with other types of traits in any way. And many people, leading scientists now, not just common people, but people that studied it, believed that traits were blended. They believe that if you had a black squirrel and a white squirrel and they had a baby, it would be gray, just like you're mixing paint colors. And we know that's not true. Mendel's data, when he's looking at these pea plants, which we're about to talk about some more, revealed patterns of inheritance. It was predictable. When we see that pattern, we mean it's predictable, right? If we look at a series of numbers, we can predict what's next based on what's been seen in the past. Genetics is the same way. We can see what traits run in a certain lineage of family and make predictions about what's about to happen. He studied plant variation in a monastery garden. You know the story, hopefully by now. He was a monk, and he bred these pea plants. He made 3 key decisions when he set up his experiments, and this is what made his findings as good as they were science-wise. Okay, 1, he wanted complete control over the breeding, meaning that he was going to take the pollen from one pea plant and he was going to put it on a little brush or a little stick of some type and move it to another pea plant. So he was going to make sure they bred each other. He put them in actually little rooms so that they couldn't pollinate, by the wind blowing or by a bee coming in and landing and getting pollen and move it. He had complete control. So he was going to make sure that one plant was bred with another plant and nothing else could change that. He used something called purebred plants, meaning that he did a lot of build-up to the point where he made his experiments. If he said this flower can only make purple flowers, it's because he had bred it hundreds of times, and every time it was a purple flower offspring. Okay, purebred refers to only able to pass on a certain type of gene. Okay, only able to. So that's what he started with. Every time that we're going to talk about here in a minute about when he would take a purple flower plant and a white flower plant and cross them, he was working with purebreds. Okay, no matter what, they were only able to pass on certain genes. And that took a lot of work to get to that point. So even before he started this scientific research, he would do a lot of breeding with these plants to ensure they could only pass on certain traits. And the last thing that he made sure about was he wanted to observe either or traits, meaning that they were going to come in one of 2 ways. So think about like seed color or pea color right here. He was going to make sure that they were either yellow or green. He didn't take traits from pea plants or any other things that it could be a yellow pea, a green pea, and a white pea. Okay, everything was either one way or another way. Hence this either or. So it had to be one way or another. It had to be purple flower or white flower, or smooth peas or rough or wrinkled peas.